So, hi everyone, I'm Rachel. I'm a sci-fi author and a creative writing mentor, and I am delighted to be talking to you again today about another aspect of world building and spec-fic. So, in the last session, I looked at why understanding the geography and environment of your spec-fic world needs to go kind of below that kind of surface level. You know, what's this place like to live in, and to kind of get a fuller understanding of well, basically the geography of the space, so you can get kind of insight into the conflicts that'll power your narrative. So today is the third of my three P's of spec-fic world building. So we've got population today, we've had power and place. And now it's time to start unpacking the kind of questions you need to ask yourself about the communities, the cultures that populate your world. So again, I've divided into main sections, and I'm suggesting some key considerations under each of them. Of course, there are many, many, many more questions that you can ask yourself as you're starting to kind of solidify your understanding of your world's environment. These are just to get you started. So let's dive in. There we go. So I'm going to start with some fairly huge questions. As always, they're literally just intended as a starting point. And as you start to unpack the answers to these questions, you will almost certainly uncover more and more questions and more information, which leads to more questions. But these are a starting point for you anyway. So first question, what are the sentient populations on your world? By sentient, I'm talking about peoples and beings capable of higher complex thought here. And maybe there is only one species that fits the bill on your world. You know, why not? That's the case in our world. Maybe you're doing a futuristic version of this world, sci-fi version of this world. Or maybe you're in a galaxy far, far away. Maybe there are multiple sentient peoples populating the world you're writing about. This question is just simply asking you to identify the answer. It's a foundational choice that will influence everything from character design to plot dynamics. And of course, it prompts so many further questions. This is a super, super wide kind of starter for 10 type question. What are their origins? How do they perceive themselves and each other? What unique abilities or traits do they possess that impact their interactions with environment, with other populations in the world or off the world, or the greater galactic sphere, and so on and so forth? Now, this is if you've been following along for the past couple of them, this is a really key question for me. It flows from the idea that, once again, there's no such thing as a desert planet. In the UK, we can't even agree on a single name for a bread roll. So this is where I have trouble buying this idea of homogenous spec-fic populations. I find them kind of troubling, to be honest. Even if they all look broadly similar, even if they all have a miracle of miracles agreed on some basic principles about what's what, diversity of thought, diversity in ability, diversity in skill, that's what makes a population strong and resilient. So it really is important, I think, to start looking at what makes your population, what makes your guys different from each other, just as much as what makes them the same. Do they have distinct subgroups? Maybe they have clans, maybe they have varying customs or languages, maybe they look slightly different. How does that variety affect social hierarchies and interactions between those hierarchies? How do different ideas coexist? Are there tensions? Are there alliances? Based on these differences, what does diversity look like in your world? Now, a big one, does your population or your populations, in fact, have religion? If so, how does it operate? Have they always had religion? Have they ever not had religion? Have they moved from being a religious society into being a secular society? How important is that religion to their society? Are there different religions within discrete groups, and how does that operate? If so, does religion have any sway over laws, customs, moral codes? How do these beliefs shape political landscapes? And remember that it can be a unifying force for some populations. It can be a divisive force for some populations as well. It can be a source of conflict as well as unification. And kind of foundationally under this broad heading, what's their creation myth? What's the story they tell themselves to understand where they came from, this population? And even if this isn't religious at all, it's a really important question. It gives you so much information about how a population conceives of themselves. And this is true even if it's something that's not kind of held as being actively, truth as such. Even if it's very much held as being a kind of a story that most people don't accept as being literal truth. If you look at Benedict Anderson's really super influential work, it's called Imagined Communities. It's quite old now, but it's still very influential. He talks about, excuse me, about how nations are socially constructed and how this idea of shared stories and narratives contributes to a sense of national identity. It's the idea of stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And a creation myth is one of the absolutely foundational stories that a population can tell itself about itself. So again, even if it never appears anywhere in your narrative, just having that kind of knowledge can unlock a lot of information about your population. Okay, moving on. What languages exist and what are the languages that are no longer used? Anybody who ever had to study Latin in school knows what I'm talking about here. It's one of those population traits that can both unite and divide us. It's a fundamental part of most sentient beings' identity. And there's evidence that the language we speak actively shapes how we interpret the world around us. I find this endlessly fascinating. So how does the language or languages in your specific world, how does that reflect their cultural nuances? So if you think about, we didn't used to have a word in English for the color orange. Now we do. We see it as a distinct color, whereas before there's a lot of evidence to suggest that we didn't see orange as a distinct color. We saw it as a shade of yellow. I find that so interesting. It's kind of world altering, So on your world, how does that work? How does the language shape the way your people interact with the world around them? Are there any ancient languages in your world that have fallen out of use but still hold historical significance? How has language evolved over time in response to cultural shifts? Are there dialects that signify belonging or exclusion? And very interestingly, how does language interact with access to knowledge in the power structures of your society? So again, when we looked at power, we looked at who has access to knowledge and how is it mediated. Language is a really, really key marker of belonging or not belonging in any society. And access to different languages can also be a way of controlling knowledge. We looked at that, of course. But, even if we're all speaking the same language, dialect also plays a huge part in marking people as belonging or not belonging to specific subgroups. You can do a lot of heavy lifting, for example, with idiom. Even in this small part of the world right here, different people from different places use different idiom, and we would be able to recognize quite quickly that somebody was either from where we're from or from a different part of Northern Ireland, just by some of the idioms that get used. So there's hardly any of us compared to the entire human race. So think about how that works on a much larger scale. Language, I just think you really, you can do a lot with language. Okay, let's move on. So we've got interaction with non-sentient life. So what are the non-sentient species on your world and how do they interact with the sentient species? I mean, this is a huge question. There's no way to answer it in full. You wouldn't even want to try. But even just getting an overview of the non-sentient populations, non-sentient species, and how they interact with your sentient guys, that's going to give you a lot of contextual information that'll feed into your world building and the narrative as a whole. So, broad strokes, what other types of creatures exist in your world? Are there domesticated species like what we consider livestock or pets? How do your sentient beings utilize these non-sentient species for food, maybe, or for labor, or for companionship? Are there any cultural taboos surrounding their treatment and so on? I mean, you don't need a full taxonomy of species here, but it is a good idea to have a sense of what those non-sentient species are, which ones are friend-shaped and which ones are apex predators that pose an actual danger to your characters, and kind of the shades in between as they are relevant to your story building. How does the environment influence the behavior and characteristics of these non-sentient beings? I mean, James Cameron's Avatar gets a lot of criticism. I don't know, maybe some of it's reasonably well-deserved, perhaps. I enjoyed it. I also know that there are criticisms that can be leveled. But what I will say about it is it seriously has considered its ecosystem and how those various sentient and non-sentient species have evolved in response to all the different environmental forces on that planet. So on your world, how do the geographical features, the climate, the resources, the weather, and so on, how do these affect the behavior and adaptations of your non-sentient species? So, for example, species or creatures in the desert, they might evolve to conserve water, like the camels have. And when you think about it, camels are kind of weird. I think you put that in specfic and somebody's going to go, wow, that's creative. Maybe they're nocturnal. Maybe they have nocturnal behaviors to avoid heat. How do seasonal changes impact migration patterns, et cetera, et cetera? Are there specific evolutionary adaptations that arise from these specific environmental challenges? Right. So ecological relationships are dependencies between sentient and non-sentient species. This doesn't sound super interesting, but it can be. This is where we start looking at the relationships that influence survival and culture. So do certain plants rely on specific animals for pollination? That's going to have a major influence on the availability of food sources for your other sentient and non-sentient life. You know, it's a resource, it's a necessary one. And if that's scarce or becomes limited, you know, that's a really important world building beat right there. So how do changes in one species affect others within that ecosystem? You could have, for example, conservation efforts, you know, conflicts over resource management. You think about bees on our planet. If our bee population disappears, well, so does our food in large part. But you know, also we breathe a gas that's excreted by plants. If all the plants disappear, we are in a lot of trouble all of a sudden. So this sort of thing may or may not be relevant to your story world, but it's a really interesting thought exercise that can tell you a lot about your population. Because honestly, I think if an alien was to look at Earth and do a thought exercise about, you know, what happens if all their oxygen goes, why are they not preserving their plants like their life depends upon it? I think it tells you a lot about your species, quite honestly. Okay, let's move on. Biology and evolution. Okay, so are there significant differences in the biology of your sentient people versus our human biology? Oh, this is so much fun. You can have so much fun with this one. I'm somebody who was influenced by Star Trek, the original series, at a tender age, and I am endlessly fascinated by the Vulcans. Now, if I were feeling mischievous, I'd start talking about season 2, episode Amok Time here, but this is a family show, so I'll veer off in a different direction and not talk about those specific biological differences. But for those of you who might not know, the thing I am going to talk about is Vulcans have copper-based blood, as opposed to our blood, which is iron-based. And that's why Vulcan blood is green. And in fact, even on Earth, we have some organisms with copper-based blood, except it's blue, not green, which is apparently more likely than green. But, you know, never let the facts get in the way of a good story. Octopuses and horseshoe crabs, for example, they have copper-based blood. There's so much narrative possibility here. So how do these different biological traits affect, for example, the abilities or weaknesses of your population? You'll often see in spec-fic races from worlds with higher gravity than ours. They're depicted as being stronger than humans in an Earth normal gravitational field. The Orville, if anybody's watching the Orville, it has a great time with that particular narrative beat. You can have so much fun with this. Just go wild, let your imagination run riot, but always remember, if this is true, what else is true, to avoid getting yourself into a bit of a narrative rut or a narrative hole. Are there any unique medical practices that arise from these differences? I mean, this may or may not be the kind of thing that directly appears in your narrative, but it is worth giving it a bit of thought regardless. It's not quite as straightforward as it first appears either. So yes, absolutely, it can be about something as, you know, prosaic as where your main character's heart is located in their body. But we can also use it to look at a more nuanced approach to medicine in general. So what are the attitudes of the society to things like illness or injury or aging? What kind of medical tech do they have? Are we talking nanobots? Are we talking rejuvenation chambers? Are we talking magic maybe, or spiritual healing? Are there taboos around certain treatments? And how do these practices reflect attitudes and understanding around concepts of life and death in your culture that you're writing about? So when I wrote Edge of Heaven, for example, my first novel, I had in mind a society with very advanced medical technology. It includes the likes of things like nanopharmaceuticals and organ regeneration and that sort of thing. But it's also very specifically a society in which there is a huge inequity of access to medical care and huge overcrowding in population settlements. So regardless of this high level medical tech, that the serious disease outbreaks are such a common occurrence that they're not even raising eyebrows for anybody. It's all kind of connected in with issues of power and economic access, which is a fundamental factor in the society that I wanted to write about. So there's lots to think about here, more than might appear at first glance. How does geography influence biology? Okay, so this is a kind of companion question to the work we started looking at in the last session, where we looked at how population adapts to a particular environment and climate. And again, it's like the Vulcans having a second island. I don't know if that's like canon or whether that's kind of whether that's from the books. But anyway, Vulcans have a second eyelid to protect against the harsh kind of blinding sun on their planet. Maybe it's the opposite on your world. Maybe the sun is extremely weak and the population don't actually use vision as their primary sense. What else might they have evolved as an adaptation to the specific conditions on your world? You can also look at things like, do geographical barriers create distinct groups of populations, and what does it look like for different populations? Or I don't know, maybe you're writing near future sci-fi set on our Earth or with sort of Earth normal humans, we haven't had a chance yet to evolve to changing circumstances. So maybe we're augmenting our biology with tech to adapt instead. So again, lots and lots of possibilities here. Okay, so some of this will, again, overlap with what we were looking at in terms of power structures and so on, but here's some questions you can ask yourself. How are interpersonal social bonds organized? We're really talking here about the likes of romantic or, well, not to be too graphic, kind of procreational bonding. So are we looking at monogamous bonding for life, monogamous bonding for the purposes of raising one specific brood and then all bets are off? Maybe you're looking at polyamorous bonding where each individual has multiple long-term partners. Maybe you're looking at short-term bonds only. And there's absolutely no need to be limited here by what works in this current socio-cultural moment either. Maybe there are some completely different social bonds unique to your population. You can have a lot of fun with that. Maybe the biology of your populations plays into that. I'm thinking particularly here of the Societies in the Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin, in which people don't actually have a fixed biological sex. They generally have no biological sex at all. And when they do, during their fertile periods, they can become either male or female. And that changes things up, as you can probably predict, in lots of fascinating ways. I love this book. I think it's fantastic. So, following on from that, what do family dynamics look like in your world? Do they revolve around biological ties? Are there adoptive relationships? Are children raised communally? Are there conflicts around different views on family? How does that work? Is there any equivalent, excuse me, to a formal marriage contract? And again, this is a concept that's so kind of ubiquitous in our cultural life that I think sometimes we forget how inherently weird it is to connect social bonds and legally in this way. Star Trek, and I know this is non-canonical, this is from one of the books, but I think it's really interesting. It proposes the idea of fixed term marriages that are automatically dissolved at the end of that term. I thought that was a really interesting idea. So in your society that you're writing, does marriage or a marriage equivalent contract exist? What does it entail? Is it legally binding or is it more culturally significant? Are there rituals associated with forming these bonds? Are there societal pressures tied to these relationship choices? And kind of tied to this a bit, what are the social taboos? We looked at this a bit when we were talking about power structures. So these are the unspoken rules of your society. So in this instance specifically, what are the taboos related to relationships, family structures, social interactions, and so on? And how are people treated if they violate those taboos? Do they vary significantly between the different cultures in your world? Then finally, we're going to look at economy, resources, and social practices. So again, some of this is very closely tied up in the questions we looked at around power. But without people, you don't have power structures anyway. So the line is very blurry. But these questions we're looking at, they are specifically world building from the perspective of the people who live in it. So what's the economy based on? Are we talking barter? Are we talking money? Are we talking something completely different? I mean, Star Trek, again, they tried to look at this kind of post-money, post-scarcity society. I'm honestly not sure how well that idea landed, to be honest, because I find that I often have to remind people that that's what we're dealing with in the original series. It seems to me sometimes, I guess, far be it from me to criticize Star Trek, the original series, but it does seem to me sometimes that the idea of that post-scarcity society is more of an idea that Roddenberry had and really liked rather than a reality that's ever fully explored in the series. But, besides which, I'm not actually sure that replicator food is any kind of advertisement for a post-scarcity society. It looks completely gross. But, it's a really important question. And again, money is so ubiquitous in our society that I think it can be a bit of an exercise to step back and look at how fundamentally weird of a concept that actually is. So anyway, what is your world's economy based on? And how does that look in practice to the people who live there? Cultural rituals or traditions tied to specific locations and resources. So another slight crossover with place, which we looked at last session. So talking, like a harvest festival or a midwinter festival, or, go a bit wider. Maybe water is a prized commodity in a place where it's difficult to find water. So there are rituals tied to spaces where water is available. Maybe there are celebrations tied to the first rains of the season. Maybe a particular place is considered sacred or special in some way. Maybe something specific happened at that place that's being commemorated. And that can be something that, the population is proud of. Like, if you think about our Titanic quarter here, I mean, I get it, but the ship sank. But anyway, we're proud of it. Or it could be something that needs to be remembered. out of respect or fear or as a warning. And here I'm thinking about places like Auschwitz, places that memorialize the very worst that humanity is capable of, places that need to be remembered because they represent something so awful, that's something that can never be allowed to be forgotten. Equally, it could be a natural feature that's used or has historically been used in a culturally significant way. So I'm thinking about Uluru in Australia, which is sacred to the indigenous peoples, that area. So it's kind of intertwined in their Dreamtime stories, which have huge cultural importance. Or there's the Lascaux caves in France. So the way the sunlight comes in through natural openings in that cave, it's thought that that may have been used in prehistoric times to mark the equinoxes and the passage of the year. And it's become a very culturally significant space to the people that live there. There's cave paintings. I mean, it's a magnificent space to visit. So what are the spaces on your world like this? So what rituals are observed there? Does everyone observe them? Why or why not? How do these rituals reinforce community bonds? How do they create a sense of community? And how do they create a sense of lack of community for folks who don't understand or observe those rituals? History. And again, history underpins everything. So your world may have sprung to life only when you started writing it, but it absolutely shouldn't feel like that. It should feel like there are millennia behind this space. So there's you want to have the sense that every single cultural circumstance that exists at the moment at which we encounter this society exists because of a series of events stretching back decades, centuries, millennia, and so on. So how have past conflicts or alliances shaped contemporary relationships between your cultures? How do historical narratives influence identity? What are the historical events that your population is actively proud of? So what do they celebrate? And how is that tied to how they see themselves when we meet them at the start of your novel? The counter to that, what are the historical events that your population is actively ashamed of? And how does that shame manifest? Do they acknowledge these events or do they try to deny them? And how is that tied to how they see themselves? Are there dissenting voices? Are there alternative narratives proposed to this kind of dominant historical narrative about your population? Are there secrets, historical secrets that have yet to come to light? What happens if they do? Maybe it's not something your novel explores, but again, it's an interesting thought exercise. How does your population's history affect relationships with other populations, either on that world or off that world, or, go nuts? What are historical alliances based on? Do they still exist, or are they in a state of flux? Are there any lingering resentments that are affecting current kind of cooperations and alliances? I mean, this is our final question. It's a massive one to close us out, but I hope you can see that it's worth spending some energy on establishing what has made your world into the place it is when we encounter it in your narrative. So again, this is another whistle-stop tour. And I think, obviously you can say that there's a lot more questions that we could be asking ourselves about this space, but that's kind of a top level kind of idea about it. Writing exercise, and hopefully you guys will be able to share this, because I know we're flicking past it at a rate of knots here. And I do want to leave some space for questions if anybody has any questions, just to finish this up. Great question. Yeah, great one from Brona there. Do you think there are any new ideas that haven't already been explored by someone? So I have thoughts about this, and I suppose at the most basic level, I do sort of subscribe to this idea of the fundamental stories, mostly because I think writers worry a lot about originality, or I want to say quote unquote originality, and that their ideas are not fresh or new or interesting. I think there are absolutely new ideas that have already been explored by someone, but I think what's more important there is that there are ideas that haven't been explored by you as a writer, and that haven't had the very specific treatment that only you as a writer can bring to this story, the understanding, the worldview, the thought processes, the thought exercises. So it's less about finding a completely new idea, and it's more about what you bring to that idea yourself that nobody else can bring to it. Yeah. Oh, Clive, that's a great one. If you look at the word nice, it means something different now than originally. So time travel with words meaning. I've actually seen this explored, and it's fascinating. So, I mean, Michael Crichton does it a little bit in, what's it called? Oh my goodness, his time travel novel, which is really interesting, where they go back in time to around about, I think, 14th century, something like that, and they try to say the word yes, and yes doesn't exist as a word. I mean, the language is completely different. And if we were transported back into that period, we wouldn't be able to make ourselves understood, and they wouldn't understand us. So yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I would love to see explored is sort of the idea of time travel into the future, and it's expecting that it's going to be all flying cars and hoverboards and everything. And what it turns out that nobody can understand a word that's being said to each other because it's constantly evolving. And when I was doing my PhD, there was a book that I read that said, a lot of people who are kind of familiar with Roman society think that it's just a question of plonking yourselves down, and just adapting to the language. And it's not, it's an entire cultural shift. And that's a society that we feel as though we know relatively well from various different cultural and historical things. I think this is an absolutely fascinating a sphere of exploration in narrative. Yeah, absolutely. Timeline, yes, Annie, thank you so much. It was called Timeline. It was made into a movie with Billy Connolly, which was an interesting choice, but I quite liked it.